do you want to go ahead and get started?
I can do that. All righty. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining the Center for Disability Empowerment's Emergency Readiness for Individuals with Disabilities. Today's topic is the politics of emergency readiness, how funding is distributed, and how we can learn to become better advocates in policy and procedural change in our community. My name is Marcie, and I am the project manager. I'm a wheelchair user with brown curly hair that is in a messy bun. I also have brown eyes, and I'm wearing a green dress with orange and yellow flowers. My pronouns are she and her. Today's presentation again is about the politics of emergency readiness, and our presenter is the Executive Director of the World Institute on Disability, Marcie Roth. Welcome, Marcie. How are you doing today?
Well, I'm just fine, and thank you very much for having me. I'm excited to be with you.
Well, I'm excited to have you and learn some more from you. But before we get started, can you tell us a little bit how you became interested in emergency readiness for individuals with disabilities?
You bet. So I've always worked in disability inclusive I've always worked in disability rights. That's been my life's work throughout my career. And in 2001, I was the director of the disability. The director of advocacy and public policy for the National Council on Independent Living. And 2 days after the terrorist attacks, I was notified by Brad Williams, who was the director of the New York Statewide Independent Living Council. And Brad told me that in New York City, they had shut down the area around Ground Zero, also called the frozen zone. And what that meant was thousands of people were only the people who had identification that they lived in that area could get in to their homes. But for thousands of people with disabilities, there are personal assistance service providers, paratransit, interpreters, lots of folks that people needed in order to navigate this incredibly difficult time couldn't get in to provide those supports. And next thing I knew, I was on my way into the White House because they were asking Nickel for help around how to figure out what they needed to do to meet, the immediate and ongoing needs of people with disabilities in the frozen zone. So I didn't necessarily have any wisdom, but I sort of found myself all of a sudden in that position of needing to help them figure it out. And that began what was a 20-year journey from never really thinking about what happens for people with disabilities in disasters to it being very much a part of the work that I've been doing. And so, here I am having this conversation with, here, we're in the middle of a global pandemic that has had an unbelievably disproportionate, horrifying impact on people with disabilities. And we'll talk a little bit about that later. But also, concurrent disasters, nonstop, Hurricane Delta, which doesn't even have a woman's name, is about to make landfall in the very same spot we had a hurricane a couple of weeks ago. And so in COVID, we are dealing with concurrent disasters and the disproportionate impact on people with disabilities is devastating. So, how I got involved was um, because we had never really considered what needs to happen for our whole community. And here I am 20 years later, and I will be honest and say, I don't think we've made much progress because we are still not ready and it is not serving our communities well.
So we need more people like ourselves. Yeah. Just so that everybody knows, Marcie has been with us with this project from the very beginning. She's been in my ears telling me how to handle certain situations and navigate relationships with other agencies that we have working with us on this project. So it's been a wonderful and exciting experience to learn from her and hopefully grow with her. So just before we get started, I believe our tech person, Jamie, is going to go over some Zoom etiquette, and then we can get started.
Yes, thank you, Marley. My name is Jamie Larmer, and again, I am your tech person. A couple of points to note. Attendees will be muted during this webinar. You can use the chat feature in Zoom to post questions and communicate with the host. This webinar is being recorded, and we will post an archive of the webinar on our YouTube channel. The link will be shared via email along with the slide deck and a resource page. To view the slide deck and panelists side by side, please refer to the control panel at the top of the screen. And a drop list of settings will come down. Click on side by side mode to see the speakers and slides simultaneously. And with that, I turn it over to you, Marley.
And with that, I turn it over to you, Marcie.
Okay. Well, and with that, I will, I didn't take the moment to introduce myself. I'm an older white woman with an invisible disability and hair that over the last 8 months has suddenly become very long and frizzy and gray because my ability to do anything else has been taken away from me. I wear red glasses and I am sitting in front of a background that reads, "Feel the power of the disability vote," which I thought was timely for today and timely for the period that we are living and working in. And I am wearing a white and gray and tan and sparkly long sleeve t-shirt because it's casual Friday and I'm feeling like I need a little sparkle.
There you go.
Yeah. So I am hoping that how we're going to spend our time today is not with a whole lot of talking head, but rather in some discussions. And I'm going to share some slides with you, but I'm entirely open to going off in whatever direction is going to give you all the most useful information for where you're at. And so I don't want us to be sort of, driven by the slides. I'm going to share my screen in a moment and, we'll start down the path with the slides. I'll give you a lot of information, but I'd like for you to ask questions along the way. And I'd like for, we do not need, from my perspective, to stay to a narrow and specific agenda. And because we're a fairly small group, and I'm looking at who is participating, and I'm wondering, do we have any government folks on the list? I'm not sure. I'm not recognizing any.
If you are part of a government agency, maybe you can you raise your hand or put something in the chat box
Okay.
for us.
We have one, Julie Pence. Super. And okay, Julie, thank you for taking your hand down. Do we, if you're from an independent living center, raise your hand if you can. Okay, we have one. If two, thank you, Jamie. If you are from a disability service provider organization, please raise your hand. Okay, we got two. If you are not affiliated with any organization, please raise your hand. Okay. If you're a funder, raise your hand, please. Yeah, I didn't think so. Another question. Have you received any emergency preparedness, response, or recovery funding in the past 5 years? Yeah, I was afraid of that. Okay. And, oh, okay. Shelby Phillips says our auxiliary donated $5,000. Okay, so that's great. For kits for youth consumers. Super. Okay, very good. So this helps me tremendously. Let me ask, have any of you, has your, oh, let me warn you, my cat will probably be showing up periodically through the discussion. This is Cheese. You probably won't see Beans because Beans doesn't like to come and say hello when I'm on Zoom, but Cheese does. Okay, so have any of you been involved, other than COVID, have you been involved in a federally declared disaster in the past? Okay, super, super helpful information. All right, so I'm now going to share my screen and let's see. And one of the things, and you don't have to do it now, but one of the things I'd really like for folks to do is if there's something in particular that you really want me to talk about, please put it in the chat. And I'm going to also want to be sure, and Marley, help me with this. Is there anyone for whom putting information in the chat is not accessible? In which case, let's make sure that we have an alternative for that person. Okay, so let me do the.
Someone would like to be unmuted. If you just raise your hand, I can give you access to talk instead of typing.
Okay, and I just had a question about recording and screen recording. Yes. Zoom will not be able to record the contents of your screen until it is quit. I'm not sure what that means. I'm going to.
I don't think I've ever seen that pop up.
Me neither. Zoom has been quite a fascinating adventure the last couple of weeks. They're making all sorts of changes. I'm assuming you want to record. So I'm gonna, oh, you know what? I'm gonna say later. Let's see if it will let me. Let's see what happens. Can I? No.
It is recording on our end, right,
Right.
Jamie?
Yes. Yeah, it is.
But is it going to let me share my screen?
It
Oh,
should. I did give you access to do so, so I
Yep.
don't see it's not.
Okay, we'll try it and we'll hope for the best. Okay. Let's see. Okay, can you see my slides?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay, and you can probably see the ones on the side, and much as I know that can be distracting, I'm going to leave them there anyway. I hope that's okay. Is that all right on your end?
Yep, it looks good on our end.
Very good. Okay. So a little bit about the World Institute on Disability before we get started. You may or may not be familiar with WID. WID was co-founded by Ed Roberts, Judy Heumann, and Joan Leon in 1983. A little known fun fact for those of you who are familiar with Ed Roberts, who is in many ways known as the father of independent living, and Judy, to this day, is known as the mother of independent living. Ed actually was an early winner of a MacArthur Genius Award, and it was that funding that helped the World Institute on Disability to get started. And for those of us who have thoroughly enjoyed Crip Camp and have really appreciated all the footage leading up to the period in which the 504 and then subsequently the 504 regulations, and then subsequently the beginning processes of planning for the ADA. It was in that period of time that Judy and Ed and Joan started the World Institute on Disability. And WID is very focused in some specific areas, always with a focus on the rights of people with disabilities in the US and globally. And I may have a chance to talk a little bit about that more, but happy to tell you more separately if you're not yet familiar with WID. And you can always visit our website and learn more about what we're doing. And I actually didn't put a slide in here about the Global Alliance for Disaster Resource Acceleration. But if we get a chance, I might talk a little bit about that at the end. So we have had an unbelievable number of catastrophic disasters in the last several years. And I've just put up a map that is from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Agency, NOAA, that shows us the unbelievable number of disasters that have cost an excess of $1 billion in damages over just the last 3 years. And two of the three highest ever were in the last 3 years. Those were hurricanes Harvey and Maria. The only one that was more costly was Katrina. And while COVID is not necessarily a weather or climate disaster, some might argue that climate is in fact very much related to COVID, and COVID will certainly ultimately be the most costly of all time. Okay, so many people think that we as people with disabilities are a separate, special, small little, subset of the rest of society. But in fact, we are, 1 in 4 adults is a person with a disability. In the US, 15 to 20% of the global population are people with disabilities. And as long ago as 2011, the World Report on Disability noted that what happens to people with disabilities has a direct impact not only on them, but on the rest of society, especially their families and communities. So readiness, emergency preparedness, planning, getting ready for whatever the next big thing is, this is not just about some small, special, separate group of unfortunate people. This is, in fact, an imperative for every community in this country and every community across the planet. And, disproportionately, we are impacted. People with disabilities are 2 to 4 times more likely to be injured or die in a disaster. And it's not because of our disability, it's because of a lack of planning and accessibility and the kinds of things that we need in order to be able to maintain our health, our safety, and our independence. And it has very little to do with our diagnostic labels or medical conditions. And for those of us who have spinal cord injuries, for those of us who have mobility disabilities, it's not because of our accessibility requirements, it's because our communities have not taken into consideration what it requires for us to be able to maintain our health, our safety, and our independence in a disaster. And so globally, not only is it recognized that we are disproportionately impacted, but also that our expertise, our leadership skills are essential for building resilient, inclusive, and equitable societies. So it's not just simply that we need to do a better job of planning for people with disabilities. It is, in fact, that we need to be at the table, at the head of the table, in positions where our knowledge and leadership skills are recognized for the imperative that the community has to be resilient, inclusive, and equitable. So this is one of my favorite slides when we talk about equality and equity. So put in other words, fair doesn't mean everybody gets the same thing. Fair means everybody gets what they need. And so as you look, when we talk about equality, we've got, a fence, a soccer game underway on the other side of the fence. We have 3 people at the fence. There are 3 boxes. The tall person is on one of the boxes. The short person is on their toes on one of the boxes. And the person using a wheelchair is next to the box and isn't able to watch the soccer game. So equity means the tall person doesn't get a box because they don't need a box. The smaller person gets 2 boxes, and the person who uses a wheelchair gets a ramp. So everybody gets to watch the soccer game. And so as we start to think about where we get, how our communities make progress, it always falls back to the same discussion. And I think that's really bottom line why we're all here today, because we get it, we're into it, we understand we need to be planning for the whole community, but where's the money? How do we find all that buried treasure? And so I'm going to first talk about grants, and I'm using some very current data, and I'm using some somewhat out of date data, not necessarily because it's out of date, but just to sort of show you that, to show you that some things really haven't changed, and there's a tremendous amount of money out there. And here comes cheese. So, over the past several years, these numbers have not changed much, but $10 billion was provided by FEMA in their Homeland Security grants, of which there are 52 different Homeland Security grants. $10.1 billion has been spent on grants. Now, I asked you all earlier, has anybody received any funding from government programs for preparedness? And the only answer I had at that point was, I believe, a non-government source, and it was $5,000 for youth consumers and for preparedness kits. So clearly, not a lot of government funds are being are dripping down to the work that you all are doing. I'll ask the question again. Have any of you all seen any of that $10.1 billion in Homeland Security grant funding over the past several years. And we have a couple of new people who just joined us, and I just want to again ask if any of you, and it surely does not seem like it. Okay. So let me further point out that it is noted that public assistance is almost 6 billion of those dollars. And you may or may not know that FEMA has, actually, I'm going to go back and give you a little bit of sort of FEMA 101. So when a governor feels as though their state, it has or is about to exceed their capabilities, their capacity to meet the needs of their people because of a disaster, the governor will request a declaration of disaster or declaration of emergency from the president. You will often hear a presidential or national emergency has been declared. That emergency declaration triggers the ability to use some federal funds as outlined under the Stafford Act. And the Stafford Act is the law that sort of cracks open the federal emergency purse. After an emergency declaration is declared, or sometimes instead of an emergency declaration, there may be a disaster declaration. So the emergency declaration is for either the period leading up to the disaster or right in the middle of the disaster. So right now, we have a national emergency declared for COVID. Every state and territory has an emergency declaration. Every state as well has requested a national disaster declaration. So in addition to the emergency deck, there is a disaster declaration. And the disaster declaration has two parts. Every disaster is either a public assistance or an individual assistance disaster, and or both. Public assistance is not like human services, which is something many of us assume it to be. Public assistance is infrastructure, it's roads and bridges and emergency supports for evacuating people, emergency protective measures to keep communities safe, but it's not a declaration that provides individual disaster relief to individuals and households. That is, excuse me, an individual assistance declaration. So right now in COVID, we have a public assistance declaration, and then we have an individual assistance declaration that each state has requested. But the only thing that's being provided under the individual assistance declaration is crisis counseling. And crisis counseling, I believe 30 of the states have asked for federal funds to provide crisis counseling in their state. And the use of those funds has been essentially to provide a hotline or a Zoom resource for people to get to speak with a non-medical professional about the crisis that they are in. A lot of money has been invested in crisis counseling, but we have been unsuccessful in learning whether or not the crisis counseling services are accessible to people with disabilities and what that looks like. I, in fact, had the opportunity just a few days ago to talk with someone who is both a professional in disability independent living and someone who was having their own personal need for crisis counseling. And this individual discovered that in their state, they were not providing accessibility for um, the phone-based crisis counseling service, something we have been raising repeatedly. And in their state, it was not, in fact, available. We'll talk about the law in a few minutes, but needless to say, that's extraordinarily problematic. And so I do see that there's a note in the box, and Julie tells us, I don't know if Job and Family Services in Central Ohio has seen any of that money. I can't speak for other counties in Ohio who may have encountered floods or tornadoes, unlike our county, which may have received disaster funding for food stamps or cash assistance. And I only know that in my county, we have not had any work to do from any disaster grants. Super helpful to hear that. And my experience has been that almost none of those funds are making their way to the disability organizations and the allies who provide the supports and services that people with disabilities need before, during, and after disasters. So there's actually a list of allowable uses of funds, and this is only examples. There are many, many uses that would apply, but as you can see, those funds can be used for inclusive meeting practices, producing materials and tools, planning for general population sheltering, training folks, equipment and supplies. The alerts and warnings systems need to be equally accessible. Gap analysis, how in your community are you identifying your gaps to meet any of the disability related requirements? You know, tracking resources. Where are the accessible vehicles? And, what are the resources available in your community for evacuation, sheltering, temporary housing, etc. There's training funds, analysis and evaluation of shelter locations, planning, and neighborhood leadership development. Those are just this is a document from FEMA, and so this is just a very basic overview of some of those areas. But as I said, it's very broad. And why is that? Well, because there are federal grant compliance requirements. And let me see if I can find, bear with me. As I said, I'm going to do a little in and out of slides. And so, yeah. So the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, which just celebrated its 47th anniversary on September 26th. I know that because it's my granddaughter's birthday. And the Rehabilitation Act is often really left out of our important discussions about the requirements before, during, and after disasters. So we typically think that we're talking about the ADA when we're talking about preparedness, response, recovery, mitigation. And we are. However, it is the Rehabilitation Act that requires that every federal dollar that is being spent by the federal government in its own work, as well as every federal dollar that is provided in financial assistance to recipients and subrecipients. So who is a recipient? The state of Ohio is a recipient. Who is a subrecipient? The towns that are getting federal funds. Who is a subrecipient? The folks in the town who are getting federal funds that are starting at the top and winding their way down to social service organizations and schools and transportation systems. Think about who gets any federal funding in your community. The Rehabilitation Act actually applies to every dollar that they are receiving. This is, it's such a big deal, and it gets so little attention. The requirement is, and as you see, I've put it in yellow, any recipient or subrecipient of federal funds is required to make their programs accessible to individuals with disabilities. Its protections apply to all programs and businesses that receive any federal funds. This applies to all elements of physical and architectural, programmatic, and equally effective communication accessibility in all services and activities conducted by or funded by the federal government. So this means that any place of public accommodation, which is covered under the ADA, any place that receives any federal funds as covered under the Rehabilitation Act, must comply with physical program and equally effective communication access. And this includes before, during, and after disasters. And let me find the slide I want to share. So there is there is now a compliance process within the Department of Homeland Securities, and it includes the state administering agency. And you all may or may not know, but your state has an administrative office, which is called your state administering agency. And that agency is responsible to the federal government for ensuring compliance. The federal government does not give up their obligation to ensure compliance, and the recipients and subrecipients also have that obligation. So that $10.1 billion that comes from FEMA to the states, every one of those $10 billion must comply with physical program and effective communication access. It's FEMA's responsibility to ensure that that's happening. It's the state's responsibility to ensure that's happening because the funds are coming through the state. And those recipients and subrecipients have that responsibility as well. And one of our greatest frustrations is that there is very little monitoring and enforcement. And you may be surprised to know that there are no waivers to these civil rights protections in a disaster. In the National Preparedness Goal in July of 2014, it was published and has been repeatedly republished that given the scope and magnitude of a catastrophic incident, waivers, exceptions, and exemptions to policy, regulations, and laws may be available in order to save and sustain life and to protect property and the environment. However, any such waivers, exceptions, and exemptions must be consistent with laws that preserve human and civil rights and protect, oops, sorry, I've got this in the way here, and protect individuals with disabilities and others with access and functional needs. In other words, there are no waivers to civil rights protections. There are no waivers to the government obligation to provide physical program and effective communication access, including in disasters. And every one of the dollars that they are spending must be spent. There are no waivers to that. And yet, here we are. We've had 211,000 plus people who have died since March. 43% of those people died in congregate care facilities. It is shocking to me that we have not said that those 43% of 211,000 people, if you do the math, that's about 90,000 people, almost 100,000 people. Of that, 211,000 are people with disabilities, almost every single one of them. Because if 43% have died in congregate care facilities, you don't go to a nursing home because you're old. You don't go to a long-term care facility for any reason other than you have personal assistance and other um, health maintenance, safety, independence, support needs that your community has not been providing or does not provide outside of that setting. You don't go to a nursing home because you're old. You go to a nursing home because you have a disability and you can't get your needs met in the community. All of those folks have civil rights protections that should not have been waived, should not be waived in a disaster. And yet, I think it's not unreasonable to say that these 90,000 dead people were not provided with the civil rights protections that the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Rehabilitation Act require. And I am going to, because I have a cat climbing on me, I am going to pause for a minute because I know I just made a pretty strong statement, and I wonder if anyone has any questions or comments or anything you'd like to sort of probe further.
Is it safe to assume that the modification of policy we've heard quite a bit about is an example of a right that has been waived for a lot of the individuals, not being able to have proper communication with someone who communicates on their behalf, who makes decisions on their behalf, that sort of thing?
So modifications of policies, procedures, and practices are only for the purpose of providing accessibility. There is no waiver to take those protections away. And so, yes, the argument that people with disabilities are entitled to the people and the tools and the resources in order to receive what they need. Yeah, I mean, it is entirely clear that many, many people, far beyond those 90,000 people who've died, many, many people have been denied their rights to modifications of policies, procedures, and practices in COVID. And you may or may not be familiar with the fact that a couple of the COVID stimulus packages have also included what are called liability waivers, meaning that if those bills were successful, that there would be a conflict between what those civil rights laws say and what legislation will have conflicted, right? It will essentially say that you do not have any liability protections if your rights are denied in a medical facility, and the liability waivers, the liability um, um, oh, there's another word for it. It'll come to me in a minute.
Mhm.
The that those are in direct conflict, and they're asking for these liability waivers to persist until 2024, um, uh, and that employers could would be allowed to discriminate. You know, if a person with a disability needed an accommodation to go back to work, they would be denied the right that they have under those civil rights protections. So clearly, if that were to pass, this would be the kind of conflict in laws that would end up at the Supreme Court. And as it stands today, there are no liability waivers. Those nursing homes, long-term care facilities, employers, they have, nothing has changed. They are required to provide the very same protections that they've been required to provide all along. Julie is saying this information is overwhelming. Yes, I know, and I'm really glad you all are wanting to learn more about it. And I realize that we're cracking open a whole bunch of incredibly complicated elements. And she said, I work with long-term Medicaid for those entering assisted living and nursing facilities. I know that most of our customers have not been able to have direct access to their family guardians, authorized representatives due to the closure of these facilities to outside entrance. I have personally heard from quite a few grieving family members who were unable to see their loved ones in a facility and could not be with them when they passed away and are traumatized in some cases that a death occurred. I have been very concerned about our customers in facilities. Yes. And the fact that folks are not talking about this, the fact that this has happened to tens of thousands of people with disabilities, I, it is, many of us are referring to it as a genocide of our siblings with disabilities. And I don't want to be hyperbolic about it, um, you know, but, you know,
Excuse
10,
me.
yeah,
But
10,
in a way, it is.
well, yeah. I mean, call it,
Um,
what else can we call this?
mhm. Wasn't there a gentleman in Texas, I believe, a quadriplegic, who was
Yes,
denied food in
yes,
a hospital?
yes. Michael, oh my goodness. And we've spent a lot of time talking about Michael, and I really want to honor him by saying his name. So it will come to me in a minute. This was a man in his 40s who had had a heart attack. And during the heart attack, he, you know, he had some brain injury that resulted in paralysis and some, you know, communication disability related stuff. But he was um, a father of, I believe, 5 children, and very much wanted to be at home with his family His wife very much wanted him to be home with his family. They didn't have the supports and services that they needed. And when they tried to move him home, a guardian was assigned. The family was denied their right to have their husband and father home. A guardian was assigned. The guardian, Michael, acquired COVID, but he was doing fine. He was moved to a hospital for additional care, but he was denied ongoing services. The guardian and the hospital decided to deny him services, and hydration, water, and nutrition, food, were withheld, and he died 6 days later. And he did not die from COVID. He died from starvation and dehydration. And there are recordings of the conversation between his wife and the doctor, in which his wife asks the doctor, "Are you withholding this because he has a disability, or are you withholding this because of his medical condition?" And the doctor says, "We're withholding this because of his disability. His quality of life is not high enough for us to treat him." So,
and that's been the sentiment for a lot of the people with disabilities who've passed away, right? We passed away, even though COVID is what, for lack of a better term, took them out.
correct.
It wasn't it's still looked at, well, they were people with disabilities. They were headed that route to begin with, which is not the case. We've got people with spinal cord injuries, paraplegics, quadriplegics who live well beyond the ages of 70, diabetics who can survive a very long time managing their disability. So,
yeah. Some of you all may, in fact, use a ventilator on a daily basis, or a BiPAP or a CPAP. People have been denied the continued use. Now, there were also some very effective lawsuits that were brought to address the discriminatory decision making and the denial of treatment and the crisis standards of care. There have been some significant wins in that regard, if you can say that, forcing government to not discontinue care for people with disabilities as a win. Yay, that's certainly a win. It's kind of hard to imagine that that's those are the stakes at this point. And Julie says, "I'm chilled and overwhelmed and horrified." Yeah, me too. And so, we are gathered here today to talk about the politics of emergency readiness, how emergency funds are distributed, and how you can help improve policies and procedures in your community. So, it's important that we understand how all of this works, and it's important that disability advocates know what's out there, know what the rights are, know what the obligations are, and then commits working together, working collaboratively, to get on the front end of all of this, because we are in fact in a position to help the rest of the community. Because we as people with disabilities have certain rights that other folks don't have, we might actually be the folks in the community who are the most valuable. We are the ones for whom the government funds are required to be spent on our accessibility. And they're not. I mean, I asked the question twice, who's getting money? And the answer has been no one. But there is an obligation, and whether it is in those federal grants, right? There is an obligation to ensure non-discrimination based on disability and equal opportunity for persons with disabilities to participate and benefit from the recipient of federal funds, programs and activities, including policy and procedures for providing program access, procedures to ensure effective communications with individuals who are deaf or hard of hearing, blind or have low vision, speech disabilities, intellectual or developmental disabilities, and policies and procedures for providing physical access to the recipient's facilities. So, in order to get at those federal funds, oftentimes you need to have funding, right? And that's part of this ridiculous catch-22, that the folks who are least funded are the folks who have the potential to use the power most effectively. And I am not one to be a conspiracy theorist, but you do have to spend a little bit of your thinking wondering if there is any correlation between not giving funds to the rabble rousers, is strategy and not simply disregard for our lives. It may just simply be disregard for the value of our lives, but it also might be, let's not give money to the folks that are going to make this harder. When I worked for FEMA for almost 8 years, the FEMA administrator would often say that disability inclusion was, for many people, just simply putting things in the too hard box. And under his leadership at FEMA, we were in a position to push people to take stuff out of the too hard box. So, whether it's disregard, whether it's too hard, or whether it's, actual disdain, doesn't matter. And so, where are we going to find the money to do this work? So interestingly, there are trusts and foundations. There are 87,000 trusts and foundations out there, and they distribute $60 billion every year. And the assets from foundations is, almost $1 trillion. And so we need to find other ways, and I'm going to refresh us. So we had, $10 billion that has been distributed each year from FEMA. We have $60 billion being distributed by foundations. Interestingly, of the almost $12 billion that has been distributed by all of the COVID-19 philanthropic efforts, this report says that people, the people who are most affected by the pandemic have been overlooked, and very little of the funding has been explicitly designated for communities of color. And we know that of those 211,000 people who've lost their lives, and many of the almost 8 million people who've contracted COVID, that the numbers of people who are Black and Indigenous and multiply marginalized are people with disabilities. And so when they say proportionally little of the $11.9 billion in funding was explicitly designated for communities of color, we would probably add, and many of their community members have disabilities. And civil rights protections that are being denied and waived and not monitored and not enforced. And so we can lament this, or we can use this information as power. And I did want to, bear with me. So one of my all-time quotes, so this is just put up a slide that shows two Chinese symbols. The first symbol is the symbol for danger. The second symbol is the symbol for opportunity. And those two symbols are used together to form the word crisis. And my all-time favorite quote, crisis is an opportunity riding on a dangerous wind. So whether that dangerous wind is a hurricane, or whether that dangerous wind is the breath and the aerosolization of the coronavirus, we need to seize this crisis as the opportunity that it presents. And we need to compel all of the funders, whether it's those government funders who have civil rights obligations, or whether it's those philanthropic funders who are beginning to discuss the disproportionate exclusion of people. We need to work collaboratively to force change. And, one of the things that the World Institute on Disability has been doing, we recently established a, um, a global alliance for disaster resource acceleration, and have been bringing together, we now have 65 countries participating from 6 of the 7 continents, which is very exciting. And what we're doing is bringing together disability-led organizations and funders to talk about how humanitarian relief, disaster funding, crisis relief is not making it to the local disability-led organizations like independent living centers, for example, in disasters. And while corporations and foundations are ponying up millions and millions of dollars for COVID, 11.9 billion over the last couple of months, virtually none of that is reaching the local disability-led organizations. And we know that it's those local disability-led organizations who are not just serving people with disabilities, but are really serving the whole community because, for example, independent living centers deal with people in crisis every day. The local public assistance, individual assistance, household assistance folks are the ones in the absence of a declared disaster who are the ones helping people who find themselves homeless, who find themselves without access to the things they need to keep them out of nursing homes, to help them to get the resources that they need for childcare and for food and for transportation. So so we're working at a very global level to begin to address this. And very simply, we're matching local organizations with corporations, not with any sort of promise of a check, but rather building a relationship so that those corporate folks can get resources into the communities, the local communities, to build capacity and build resilience. We have a long way to go, but if we are going to be successful in, moving the political, the politics of emergency readiness, we collectively, whether it's, folks in Ohio, whether it's, disability leaders and allies across the US, or whether it is a global alliance of folks, we need to use our power, the power that we have in human rights and in some places civil rights. We need to use that power to strengthen our communities and strengthen our community resilience. If community resilience is not seen as inclusive of people with disabilities, communities are and will fail. So we have both a responsibility and an obligation to our communities. And so let's work on that together. Let's find ways to build our shared capacity. There is a group. I was previously with the Partnership for Inclusive Disaster Strategies, and very proudly still on their board. And the Partnership for Inclusive Disaster Strategies has been meeting every single day since February 28th, focusing on disability rights and COVID and concurrent disasters. We've met every single day, weekends, holidays, every day, 6 p.m. Eastern. You're all entirely invited to join us, and Marlie, certainly you can help us to make those connections if there are people who want to come once and listen or want to come on a regular basis. There are people who are working on this every single day. And so you all as a community can be a tiny little bit involved, a lot involved, hugely involved. But you have incredible opportunities that are riding on this dangerous wind that is blowing all around us. Questions, comments? What would you like to hear about? Where can we listen in at 6 p.m. Eastern? I will put that number in the chat.
And I would be happy to put it in the follow-up email I sent to everyone.
Excellent. Perfect.
Mm-hmm.
As someone who works with the youth, what is the best way that youth, whether they are of voting age or not, can get involved?
There are a million great ways for young people to get involved. And I would love to hear about what folks, like, where are they at in terms of their current interest in preparedness. Are they wanting to be part of those discussions? Are they wanting to be involved in local preparedness initiatives? Because, one of the other pieces of all of this, for all of that readiness money that is coming into your state and coming into your community and not quite making its way to you, one of the things is money is being spent on exercises, drills, simulations. Different people call it different things. And for young folks, getting involved in these exercises, simulations, is just a really great way to connect with your community, and begin to understand some of what's happening in your community around readiness. I am such a huge fan of disaster exercises. I was just having this conversation with somebody yesterday about how, when I was growing up, it was, all about the fire drill in school. And I think almost all of us have had our experiences with the fire drills in school. And, if you have a mobility disability, you are often left behind, or, you don't need to participate in this. For most people, it was, let's see how fast we can get everybody out of the building. The last time we did it, it took us, 96 seconds, and today we're going for 95 seconds. And so there was this real motivation to not include people with disabilities, because if your goal is to be faster, yeah, we might slow up the process a little bit. But the purpose of that exercise is to make sure everybody survives if it actually happens. And so the purpose of exercises is not to show ourselves how good we are at it. The purpose of exercises, again, I'm going to quote Craig Fugate, my former boss, head of FEMA. The purpose of exercises is to break stuff. That's like your perfect opportunity to, layer on all sorts of, here's what we planned and here's what we didn't anticipate. And oh no, all of those accessible buses that we were planning to use to get folks the heck out of Dodge are all off on a field trip, 3 counties away. Now what do we do? And you do it in an atmosphere where nobody's going to die because it's a simulation, rather than and you're going to have your oopses in an actual disaster. You will always have your oopses in an actual disaster. So your planning should be the golden opportunity to get better at anticipating when something is about to be a problem, and then rewarding brainstorming, teaching people how to be good at plan B or plan Z. And who is better at that than just about anybody? Oh, wait, people with disabilities, because we have to anticipate on a daily basis and we have to solve problems on a daily basis. We are really, really good at that. So, getting young folks involved in things like exercises, and particularly getting an array of young people with disabilities involved, it's fun. It's actually, it's a great social opportunity. It's a career potential opportunity. If you're into theater, sometimes some of those exercises involve moulage, which is, looking like you just had your head halfway chopped off. And, some people really like that. Nursing homes are required to have 2 exercises every year. One of them is required to be a full scale exercise, which means getting out all the toys and like literally getting people out of buildings and using all those shiny red things that make fumes, right? And then the other one is a tabletop exercise where you get to sort of hypothetically break things and hypothetically fix them. And I'd love to talk with you more about all of that. And I see we're almost at time. I can keep answering questions if you have more, or we can, move on. But let's keep this discussion going and see how we can work together.
And recently, Jamie and I were in a meeting, and we've been thinking a lot about youth with disabilities in the school systems and who are employed as well. Like I didn't even participate in the office drills, but until the power outage in my office, and I had to roll down the stairs backwards and realized the stairwell wasn't accessible. So then I had to call the fire department to come get me. But we realized that this is a very small way that we can be part of that process in emergency preparedness.
That's right.
And when I was doing my research for this project, I learned about the gentleman at the towers. When they went down, he was on the 69th floor. He's a quadriplegic power wheelchair user and survived, guys, on the 69th floor. And he survived because he had a plan. He practiced his plan with his coworkers. They were involved in the drills that his office had every time. So when the attack occurred, he was ready. His coworkers were ready. The anxieties of the day in that particular moment were put aside because they had the expertise, the know-how to make sure that they're all out of there safely.
Yeah.
They had a plan.
Yes.
And that's right. They had a plan. They exercised their plan, and others have learned from that plan. And you know, we can lament the crisis, or we can grab the opportunity. I vote for the opportunity.
Does anybody else have any more questions, comments, concerns?
I hope you have concerns, but I hope you also feel some sense of, okay, there's a bunch of people working on this and don't have to figure it out yourselves.
What I've learned is that I need to join those people to help.
We want you.
Thank you, Deborah. Does anybody have anything that they would like to say or comment on? I know this was a lot, and it was definitely an overwhelming topic, but it is a much needed topic, I believe, especially in this day. So don't be afraid to ask. Don't be afraid to use your voice.
And I think, forgive me if I'm speaking out of turn, but if anybody can't think of anything right now, you can definitely get back to us and we can get you the information.
You bet.
Absolutely. I still have Marcie for another at least until December to work with me. So we can definitely send all any comments, questions that you might have to her.
And yeah, I mean, we're all in this together. So let's, by all means, keep this going.
Okay. Well, if there are no other questions, I would like to say thank you to our presenter, Marcie Roth. We were so happy to have you with us today. I was very excited to have you.
Well, thank you. And, you know, happy to come back.
Hopefully we can continue this work together and help make Ohio's residents even more safer for future emergencies.
Yeah.
And on that note, I do want to also say thank you to Jamie for our tech person. I wanted to say thank you to PRI Captioning for their fantastic services.
Always.
Yes, and I wanted to thank everyone in attendance today. I really appreciate you all for being with us, and I look forward to our next scheduled presentation, which is Monday, October 12th at 11 a.m. And we'll be talking about service animals, how to keep them safe, and how to make sure that they are prepared for emergencies should you need to be evacuated. And with that said, if no one else has anything else to say, I will let you guys go to lunch.
Bye, everybody. Be safe and well.
Everyone.
Make sure you
so
vote.
Much. Yes.
Make sure you vote and help other people to vote.
Yes.
Bye.
Take care.